did you get out of it?
Nothing. I just felt I had no mind. I felt something else was controlling me.
Welcome to Very Scary People. I'm Donnie Wahlberg. Between July of 1976 and June of 1977, David Berkowitz was busy making nightmares a reality, maiming or killing 11 innocent victims. Certain he was targeting long-haired brunettes, women began cutting and coloring their hair. Couples avoided going out, all to escape being attacked by the son of Sam. Panic in New York City was mounting. Where and when would the killer strike next? Police had no real leads. And finally, a mistake puts an end to the terror. This is part 2 of Son of Sam, I Am a Monster.
He struck in the dark of night, popping out of the shadows in the Bronx and Queens.
There was nothing that told them the killer was about to open fire on them, and he did.
A killer made his way from one dark street to another without a face, a name, without an identity. He was an M.O.
Everyone agreed that it was a young white male, between 25 and 30 years old, about 6 feet tall.
I am a monster.
I am the son of Sam.
It scared the shit out of 7 million people that lived in the city.
Young people stopped sitting in cars, stopped going out, or went out only when they absolutely had to.
Everybody was afraid.
Because they really don't know where he's going to turn up next.
It captivated this city for an entire year.
So who was this monster that was stalking the city of New York?
I knew it was wrong, but when a mind is captured, like by Satan, you can't look at things and evaluate things in their right perspective.
He was adopted by Pearl and Nathan Berkowitz. He seemed to have a relatively normal childhood at first, but then behavioral issues started to bubble up.
His adoptive mother died of cancer when he was 14.
What was that like for you?
Completely devastating.
June 26, 1977. Judy Placido, 17 years old, and Salvador Lupo. They had gone out to a disco in Queens. At the end of the night, they walked back to the car and got inside.
They were actually talking about the murders happening and how scary it was, and then it hit them.
The same thing that's happened before. A figure walks up, takes a shooting stance, and bang.
That particular night, my partner and myself were just a couple of blocks away. By the time we got there, it was said and done.
He's evaded capture.
Even though Judy and Sal survived, they really couldn't provide any description to the police. Police, once again, were stumped.
Those things create an image that he will not be caught. The police cannot see him. He is a wisp of smoke that just dissipates into the air.
So there was no plan on how I'm going to get away with this?
No.
No plan to deceive?
No. I was just a real mess.
The police really have nothing to go on. Is there going to be another shooting? Of course, the police knew there would be. More police officers are assigned Queens and the Bronx, but he won't strike there again. Now he will strike in Brooklyn.
On July 31st, 1977, Robert Violante and Stacy Moskowitz were out on a date in Brooklyn.
Stacy's mom, Nisa Moskowitz, said, "You be careful tonight, sweetheart." The warning could not prevent the nightmare. Stacy's response was, "Mom, I'm a blonde."
And at the end of their night, they drove down to a park underneath the Verrazano Bridge, which was a well-known lover's lane.
They were in an area where couples would park.
They got out of the car and walked over to the swing set. But they saw a man watching them and decided to return to the car.
And at that moment, the shooting occurs.
Whoever would have been in that particular spot would have gotten killed. It was my daughter's unfortunate luck to have been there.
He approached the car and he fired through the window.
I was covered with blood, and the girl was covered with blood. It was a horror. This guy screaming, just screaming and screaming.
Stacy Berkowitz was transported to the hospital where she died.
And Robert Violante was shot and blinded for life.
And that's something very dear to me. Great kid.
You have to really feel for the cops on this. They're waiting for something that will let them put things together.
They want to stop the killer. They have to stop the killer.
Inevitably, killers make mistakes, and so did the son of Sam. It seems that David Berkowitz had looked into his background shortly before he started his killing spree.
He wants to find out more about his birth family.
David had this idealistic view of what his real mother and father would be like. And unfortunately, he isn't happy with what he finds out.
My parents told me, I think when I was around 5 or 6 years old, that I was adopted. I really had a hard time with that because my parents, meaning well, and probably under the instruction of other people, were told to tell me that my mom had died while giving birth to me and that my dad couldn't care for me, so he put me up for adoption.
But that wasn't true, was it?
No.
His father, Nate, finally told him the truth. His mother hadn't actually died in childbirth.
I think now, looking back in retrospect, there was times I had a lot of guilt because I thought that somehow, in some way, I was responsible for the death of my mom. I see it did cause a lot of difficulty in my life. I had internal struggles over that issue.
David was actually born to Betty Falco.
David is the baby out of wedlock.
She had had an affair.
Her pregnancy with David was in fact a product of the affair, but even more disturbing to David was the fact that Betty had a daughter named Rosalind, 13 years older, that she had never given up.
And he went to great length to search out his natural family. And he actually met his natural mother, his sister, and her children, and they had, at one point, a nice relationship. And then ultimately, he felt greatly rejected by his natural mother, Betty, because although she retained and cared for his sister, she chose to give him away.
This would cause a deep-seated and harboring rage within him.
The psychiatrist found the interaction with the birth mother and his older sister quite significant in terms of what may have led him to kill.
These are all very powerful experiences in the life of someone who feels inadequate to begin with.
The abandonment by his mother, the death of his adoptive mother, the fact that he never had a girlfriend, all of these negative experiences really bubbled up into a rage where he wanted to get back at women.
At that point, he was certainly delusional, and I think his delusions pushed him in the direction of these horrible crimes.
And very shortly after, we'll start out on this rampage.
When David Berkowitz aimed and shot each of those young women, he is symbolically killing every woman who has ever rejected him or let him down.
looked me straight in the face. He looked at my dog. And right here, we crossed each other.
Cecilia Davis didn't like the look of this guy, so she hurried home. And just as she got inside her house and closed the door, she heard the rain of bullets, the shooting that took the lives of Robert and Stacy. She told the police about this strange man she saw just before the shooting, and she remembered something else.
On the night of the Moskowitz shooting, she saw the police officers issuing a summons to a car.
It was right next to the hydrant by her home.
So the first thing you do is you pull all the summonses that are issued.
Boring, yeah, but it's something that had to be done.
There could be other witnesses besides Cecilia Davis who could give them a clue as to who the shooter is.
The police looked for the ticket, and they couldn't find the ticket.
There was a thought that maybe there was no summons, sir. But she was so positive of it. Where is it? I found out who the police officer was that had that sector, called him on the phone. And I asked him, did you issue a summons? And he said, yes. And I asked him, well, why wasn't the summons turned in? He said, the chaos that night, when somebody gets shot, the last thing you're thinking about is that stupid summons. And he just forgot about it, and he stuck the summons in his hat.
The patrolman who wrote the ticket didn't submit the ticket. He put it in his locker for a couple of days.
Again, this whole thing is going towards a possible witness.
I went in and I looked in the summons receipt book.
They found 4 that were handed out that night by the police.
And there's a parking ticket for a vehicle that isn't even a New York City vehicle. It's from this northern suburb, Yonkers.
From a car that was parked at a fire hydrant, a Ford Galaxy, to someone named David Berkowitz.
They're looking at this and thinking, what is this guy, from Yonkers, doing in Brooklyn in that neighborhood?
It just seemed out of place.
There was a higher power, as they say. So Justice picks up the phone, and he calls the Yonkers PD. And the very pleasant woman answers the phone. Thank God, the person on the switchboard was Wheat Carr.
Wheat Carr was the daughter of Yonkers resident Sam Carr. Over the previous year, the Carr family had been harassed by somebody.
They had a dog named Harvey, and Harvey would bark.
The harasser sent threatening letters complaining about Sam's barking dog, threw a Molotov cocktail into their yard.
And one night, the person shoots their dog.
The Carr family had figured out that the person doing it was their neighbor, David Berkowitz. So when Detective Justice calls Yonkers to look into Berkowitz as a possible witness to the Moskowitz murder, by complete coincidence, Wheat Carr picks up the phone because she just so happens to be a dispatcher for the Yonkers PD.
It was being at the right place at the right time, so to speak. And as soon as I mentioned David Berkowitz, she said, let me tell you about him. I know him. He lived in the apartment house directly behind where her and her father lived. She then related a story about a black Labrador retriever being shot by Berkowitz, and the fact that Berkowitz was strange.
He says, he shot your father's dog. Yeah. What's your name? Wheat. In one of the letters, he said Wheaties. Oh, okay. Well, what's your dad's name? Sam. Sam. And every great detective has instinct.
I went back to my command, and my inspector was there. And he said, well, how did it go? And I said to him, I think we got the guy.
And the next step was to set him up so that they could make an arrest.
On August 10th, 1977, NYPD detectives take a road trip up to Yonkers, New York, and coordinate a stakeout on that Ford Galaxy. It's parked right outside of David Berkowitz's apartment.
And they looked in the car.
And they see a duffel bag with a gun sticking out of it, and this letter in that Son of Sam handwriting.
So what they did was they set up a surveillance on the car, and they wait.
Sure enough, about 10 p.m. that night, a white, heavy-set man with dark hair comes out and approaches the car.
He's got a brown paper bag in his hand. He puts it on the car seat.
Within seconds, police have surrounded the vehicle.
He says, put your hands on the dashboard, turn the ignition off, which he does.
He immediately said, "You got me." And they said, "Who do we got?" And he said, "I'm the Son of Sam."
He's just smiling at them.
He gives himself right up.
In the bag on the front seat of the car was the .44 caliber gun that killed all those people.
Game over.
This is the man police say is the .44 caliber killer. Young, dark-haired, almost chubby.
When it came in to the building, we all had the same reaction. How ordinary looking this guy was.
I think his appearance was almost startling to people.
All along, we think we're gonna find this screaming, crazy guy.
He was a regular Joe.
He had a big smile on his face.
He was almost enjoying the fuss, the excitement.
I'm very pleased to announce that the people of the city of New York can rest easy this morning. Police have captured a man whom they believe to be the Son of Sam.
I was at the press conference. You can imagine what this moment is like across the entire New York City Police Department.
Well, I was elated. It was a wonderful feeling.
People were in the streets, they were partying. And it was all over the radio, TV.
I had tears in my eyes, but I was happy, you know what I mean? I feel so great that nobody else is gonna get hurt anymore now.
David Berkowitz, when arrested, 24-year-old guy, was working at the post office.
People who knew him said I would have had no idea.
He went to the post office where he worked, and they're all in disbelief.
He had been escorting some of his young female colleagues to walk to their cars because of this mass murderer on the loose.
One fellow says, well, every morning he would have the newspaper, and at that time, this was in the newspaper every day, front page. And he would turn around and say to them, I hope we get this son of a bitch. To me, that was crazy.
They bring him to New York City, to the chief of detective's office.
We stuck him in a room all by himself, and all the detectives that had a case went in, interviewed him.
We all had a shot at him, questioning. It was an eerie feeling, because here's the conclusion of all that we did, and it's in front of us.
David just tells them everything.
He went through each of the killings.
He knew every detail. He knew how he shot every victim. He knew the conditions of the street. He knew where he shot the victims. He knew what part of the body he shot them in.
He was very nonchalant, sometimes a little bit of a smirk, which kind of unnerved you a little bit.
He was so proud of what he had done, that he was so famous, and he couldn't wait to tell everybody about it.
He was, frankly, as he told me, greatly relieved.
In his confessions to police and subsequent interviews, David Berkowitz would provide the details that would shed light on each of those individual killings.
One of the first shootings, he said that I saw the two girls in a car. I went around the block. There was my sign. There's this beautiful parking space. I pulled right into the parking space, walked up, shot them, got back in the car and drove away. A spot to park his car was what got these girls shot.
After the second one, he pulled over at a White Castle hamburger restaurant and had a meal.
There were a number of times when we learned through the interviewing process that Berkowitz had gone out, perhaps intending to shoot, but did not.
He was out every night driving around waiting for something that triggered him to go shoot somebody.
He probably traveled 400, 500 miles from one borough to another. And he was just searching out victims.
It was all opportunistic.
There was never a specific rhyme or reason. It was just random shootings. He told me that his primary object was the female.
And of course, in those days, young men wore their hair kind of long, so you didn't know whether you were necessarily shooting a male or a female. In some instances, the men were hit also.
He was embarrassed that he even shot at men because that wasn't his objective. There were some stories, unfortunately, where they just missed the killer. There was a code put out, the 44 code. When that happened, the bridges were going to be manned by police officers after a shooting incident. There were 2 police women guarding the toll booths. The killer was in the 3rd car to come. The gun was on the seat next to him. The 2 police decided they weren't going to have any business tonight, and they left just as the cars were pulling up, and he would have been stopped right there. In 1975, at Christmas time, David decides it's time for blood. So he accosts a young lady on a footbridge that spans a parkway in the Bronx.
He described stabbing her multiple times.
He thought that that was going to be an easy way to kill a person. He apparently had some ideas from TV shows that the person was just going to get stabbed, collapse, and die. And instead, this particular woman fought back.
She starts to scream, and that disturbs him.
She didn't die. There was a little bit of panic that he described with a knife actually going into another human being's flesh.
He ran away. I guess then after that, he decided he's going to use a gun.
He really didn't want there to be too much of a messy scene for him. He wanted to do it, get it done, and go away.
He had a friend purchase him the gun down in Texas.
He will go to another state, get a straw purchase of a handgun, and come back to New York and start a shooting spree where you can shoot from a distance. It's less personal in the same vein.
Welcome back to Very Scary People. After his arrest in 1977, David Berkowitz readily admitted to police that he was the man they'd been searching for, the serial killer known as the Son of Sam. The city was relieved to get him off the streets, and it couldn't have happened at a better time. On the night of his arrest, Berkowitz was allegedly going out to kill again, this time headed to a nightclub in Long Island where he planned to carry out a mass shooting. But there were still many questions that remained. In the first interrogation and confession, investigators asked the question everyone wanted to know. Why did he kill?
David Berkowitz told the police that it really wasn't his fault. He was doing the bidding of a powerful demon that was speaking to him through his neighbor Sam Carr's dog.
He fixates on this Carr family mainly because of the dog.
The dog kept howling and waking him up.
And caused him a great deal of sleep deprivation.
He said that the dog barking was sending him a message from a 6,000-year-old man named Sam and telling him that he had to go out and kill.
And so he was the Son of Sam. That's what he called himself, because he said the demon told him to do it.
I had nothing against these victims. Who were these people to me? They were just people. I wasn't angry against them. Who was to do it? Well, Sam did it through me. He used it. He made me go out there and do it. I did it for him, for blood.
It was pure chance. It wasn't a calculated thing. The demons would tell him, hey, this is the one, do it.
David clearly, at the time these crimes were committed, had a very reduced mental state. The best word I could use is delusional. He had delusions about everything around him.
When the police got into his apartment, they found something they were not ready for. His apartment shows a tormented soul.
He kind of closed up his apartment and put curtains over the windows and really isolated himself.
One entire wall of Berkowitz's apartment was covered in, I will use the word, bizarre writings. There were writings about Sam Carr.
A lot of writings about Satan.
They were the writings for the demons, where they lived, who they were.
There was actually a hole in the wall. He said somebody lived in that hole.
Sometimes he'd go home without finding anybody, and it depressed him. And then the hole in the wall would respond and say, well, you have to go out and do this again.
Who does that?
Today, Berkowitz's 68-year-old father held an emotional news conference to try to explain, to try to reach out to those his son allegedly hurt.
I will live with this heartache for the rest of my life. I am so deeply saddened that nothing that I can say can really express my deep feelings and sorrow for all you parents. My prayers will be with you all.
Berkowitz was brought to court in an 8-vehicle motorcade.
David and I went to the Supreme Court in Kings County, where an arraignment was conducted. There must have been literally over 3,000 media people from all over the world.
Would there be a trial? Would he be set free? There were 101 questions.
What surprised me was how calm he was. Usually people are very erratic, they can become violent at times, but he was very friendly, very cordial, and at that point, very contrite. I found him to be very, very bright, very perceptive, actually brilliant. I guess there's a very thin line between insanity and genius.
First order of business then became determining whether or not he was competent to stand trial.
I felt for sure they would just put him in a nut house and that'd be the end of it.
It was clear from the letters that he had written that he had a disordered mind. Under the law, a person who is legally incompetent cannot be tried.
Eventually, he has to go in for evaluation, which he did.
The outward appearance of Mr. Berkowitz was normal. And in responding to the psychiatrists, for the most part, he sounded, I'll use the word rational. However, when questioned about the killings and about why, what he was articulating was what those first doctors called a fixed delusional structure. I did this because the demons on Earth, speaking through Sam Carr's dog, were telling me they needed blood. That was how he articulated to the doctors why he killed.
Their opinion, that Berkowitz is not competent to help his lawyers or understand the proceedings, not competent to stand trial.
Reality was, there was no way, given the intense pressures on the district attorneys, the terror that the city had suffered, that a finding of incompetence was going to be acceptable to the powers that be.
He simply killed too many people, and they couldn't let that go by. If you spoke to him for 30 seconds, you could see he was crazy. But there were too many dead bodies around, and somebody had to account for them.
So they put another psychiatrist in.
Brooklyn DA's office hired Dr. David Abrahamson. Abrahamson says, well, look at the way in which he is able to talk to us about everything.
This was someone who knew what he was doing. He was smart enough to come up with a psychological discussion to explain away his crimes by making us think that he was some kind of mentally ill, psychotic person. But one of the things that we know about people who commit an offense like this is you can't be a madman and do the kind of planning and execution that a man like this did.
Abrahamson said Berkowitz was not lacking in capacity. He thought that he was actually malingering. He can control his actions because he tells me that on occasion he would go out and would not kill.
And on the basis of that, David was found competent to stand trial.
He could have gone to trial and tried the insanity defense. His lawyers believed that he should try to claim it.
But the next month or so, the doctors at the hospital allowed a minister to see him. And David is converted to Christianity. Well, what happened, Berkowitz says, I am going to plead guilty. I'm not going to use an insanity defense because I'm going to be giving credence to these demons. And I can't do that. And Jesus has saved me.
I just wanted to end it, and I was just so distraught. I just confessed and pled guilty and got it over with.
They consolidated all the cases, had him come in and enter a guilty plea.
Then it just became a matter of sentencing after that.
What ultimately happened with Berkowitz is sentencing was set maybe 10 days later, and a very disturbing scene occurred.
There was no hint of trouble to come as Berkowitz was driven to court in an armored van. But once inside, a struggle broke out on the 7th floor. Berkowitz said he didn't want to be sentenced. He kicked and bit some of 5 officers trying to move him. 2 officers were hurt, but not seriously, before Berkowitz was finally subdued. In court, spectators waited. When Berkowitz was brought in, it was evident he was still agitated, wild-eyed, in handcuffs.
And the moment he hits the center of the courtroom, he starts to sing-song chant.
Shouting repeatedly, "Stacy was a whore, I'd kill her again."
It's one of the few times in my career I wanted to get up and attack a person who was speaking.
He had to be wrestled down and dragged out of the courtroom. It was a very chilling scene, and I'm sure it was quite disturbing to the families of the victims and the victims who were present to see the surface veneer of normal appearance disappear and be replaced by something scary. I believe that David Berkowitz was a profoundly disturbed human being.
To me, his appearance in court just locked it in. This is a guy who killed because he hated women.
Ultimately, he was sentenced to a number of sentences of 25 years to life.
It's 25 to life for each of the 6 victims.
The maximum for each of the crimes committed.
Plus additional time for attempted murders of his other victims.
I don't have a whole lot of hate and anger.
possibly because I'm still alive. I don't forgive him.
I would have liked more to have happened to him. The electric chair, for instance.
When I first came to prison, I was very suicidal. And I was disgusted with my life. I was angry at a lot of people. I saw no hope.
Can you tell us what happened to your neck? It's so obvious. That's a nasty scar.
Yeah, in 1979, another inmate, I guess to make a name for himself, tried to take my life. And he snuck me when I wasn't looking with a razor and opened up the whole side of my neck.
David admitted that he was a fraud.
He said he made the whole thing up, that he was just lying and malingering with that son of Sam and the barking dog telling him to kill. That he knew what he was doing and he knew that it was wrong.
And that his effort to look like a psychologically deranged person was part of his facade to excuse the behaviors that he did. This was not the demons in his head. This was his own psychological disturbance.
Later, he would insist that he did not act alone, that he was actually acting on behest of a satanic cult, and they forced him to do these things, and there were other people who conspired with him and were part of the shootings.
You were sort of satanically involved?
Yes, I was. It was the worst mistake of my life. I was lonely. I was looking for companionship.
There's never been any evidence to support that there were other people involved.
He'll say at the moment what he feels people want to hear.
What kind of work do you do?
I work in the mental health unit, and I'm there as like a peer counselor for the men that have emotional problems.
Do you get psychiatric counseling?
No, I don't, no. The Department of Corrections has given me a clean bill of health.
After spending time in prison, David became pretty much a born-again Christian.
During his time in jail, an inmate befriended David, and he started to introduce him to the Bible.
Prison is not easy, but over the years, God has given me a lot of strength and a lot of hope to make it and to endure and to survive.
He even changed his nickname and his whole image to the Son of Hope instead of the Son of Sam.
I feel that God has completely forgiven me, and He's taught me how to forgive myself.
Have you ever had to deal with relatives of the victims directly? What would you say?
I'm sorry.
Nisa, I understand this guy Berkowitz actually has sent you a card on Mother's Day. He has written you letters.
I have many letters from him.
Do you believe he's a changed man? I mean, he says he's found God in prison. Do you think there's some sort of bid, maybe holding out hope he might get parole someday?
No, he makes me feel like stone inside of me. He's an animal.
You're going to be here the rest of your life, right?
That's right. I'm doing consecutive life sentences totaling more than 300 years.
What do you do with something like that?
Larry, believe it or not, I've learned to just be content and accept the fact.
He comes up every 2 years for parole and doesn't even ask for a hearing now.
When I spoke to David and discussed the legal approach that we could take to get him released, he basically said to me, "I'm okay. I've already been freed by a greater spirit."
I don't want to sound harsh, but they will suddenly find God, and now I'm a changed person. Some of them may have. I don't believe he did.
I would love to think that he's suffering every minute of his time there, but I also think he should have been eradicated.
And you notice every interview of that son of a gun never mentions the killings. All he talks about is, I've changed, I help others. He doesn't talk about the dead. He should die right where he is. That's a terrible thing to say, but that's how I feel about it.
I hope he suffers for the rest of his life. I hope he never has a minute's peace. I hope he suffers and just eats his heart out with a cancer. Because he's nothing, he's not human.
Interestingly, one other thing found in Berkowitz's apartment was a journal with detailed dates and times of fires. Fires that some people believe he set himself. Was the serial killer also an arsonist? It's one mystery that we may never know. Oddly, over time, some people started to believe the Sam in Son of Sam was the name of the dog that allegedly tormented Berkowitz and gave him his murderous orders. But it was actually the dog's owner, Sam, that helped give the serial killer his moniker. I'm Donnie Wahlberg. Thanks for watching. Good night.